All right, thank you. I think we're going to get started now. Appreciate everybody for that's able to join us today as ADC as we continue to provide important information to community members during this COVID crisis. There's definitely a lot going on and a lot of information we'd like to get to our membership, as we get through this together. Today, we're going to be discussing tenant and housing rights with our partners at the National Fair Housing Alliance, who've done an incredible job throughout their history on protecting the rights of our community members and other community members when it comes to housing issues. Now, housing discrimination is something ADC works on, and I know from talking to community members, it's not something we often consider or something we're often aware about. But this is where an organization like the National Fair Housing comes in and provides us guidance and the resources needed to really tackle a lot of these issues. So obviously with COVID happening, a lot of issues are coming up. We have been receiving a lot of emails and inquiries from our community members about their housing situations, what options are available to them, and other situations they're running through. We are lucky to be joined by Mr. Morgan Williams, who's the General Counsel of the NFHA. He's responsible for their strategic and tactical legal initiatives and affairs. He leads their efforts to pursue pioneering litigation under the Federal Fair Housing Act, often utilizing testing-based evidence and working in partnership with National Fair Housing Alliance network of local fair housing centers. He coordinates their actions to file amicus briefs to promote sound fair housing jurisprudence. So Mr. Williams is somebody we've worked with on a number of cases and somebody that we're proud to call a partner in this fight. So I'm going to turn it over to Morgan. I'll probably ask a few questions, and then I know you have a presentation, but I do want to start off with, and this is a simple question. This is for our membership and a lot of folks who may not be familiar. What's housing discrimination look like? How is this something that is that can be identified and can be addressed?
Well, Abed, thank you for that initial question and for having me here today. And thank you all for joining us. I want to say that we at the National Fair Housing Alliance have appreciated a partnership with ADC over the last few years to assist in coordinating on investigating and enforcing housing discrimination against Arab American communities and housing consumers. And we appreciate the opportunity to link up with you today amid this crisis that's unfolding around the country and around the world. Housing discrimination is something that has plagued our country for the history of our country and is an outgrowth of segregation and discrimination that has shaped the housing market and the broader markets around our country. And in terms of your question of what it looks like, it takes many forms. In some instances, housing discrimination can be overt and direct. And unfortunately, we've heard reports, in particular amid this crisis, of increased discrimination against Asian Americans who are associated with the origins of the virus. And that stereotype is generalized, and Asian Americans are experiencing increases in hate crimes and other acts of violence and aggression and harassment. And to the extent that those acts occur within the housing setting, then they would constitute discriminatory harassment. Housing discrimination, though, can take a much more subtle and in some ways pervasive form. And that is what we refer to in some instances as discrimination with a smile, or revolving door discrimination. And that is a housing consumer can go in and inquire about a housing option and be given some limited set of options or some set of terms that are less favorable than a housing provider might be given to another person of a different demographic. And that person, because of its subtle nature, may not actually fully understand or know that they're being discriminated against. And they may get a smile and a handshake and be shown the door. And in that way, we call it revolving door discrimination. And in those instances, we use fair housing testers or mystery shoppers to inquire about the availability of housing and use that difference in treatment that can be done in a controlled fashion when you send in multiple individuals of different demographics to see that difference in treatment. And that's then used for enforcement purposes. But another profound way in which discrimination can occur is in different kinds of policies that may on their face not be discriminatory, but when put into practice, they have a discriminatory effect. And so those are various forms in which discrimination can occur, Abed.
Thank you for that. And it's appreciated. And I know I want to, transition over to what we're experiencing now with COVID and, try to get some information out there for our membership. And I'll start off by one question, and you can take it from here. And it's the question a lot of people are asking us is, hey, I can't afford to pay my rent and I'm facing eviction. Or my landlord is threatening to evict me from my apartment or from my home because I can't pay my rent because of COVID. I can't go to my job, I can't go to work. And I know your organization has put up a good number of resources that are available and have worked on this issue. But if you could just touch on, what are the rights of tenants during this crisis and in general that are available to them?
Well, it's an important question as our country faces an unprecedented economic crisis in regards to tremendous unemployment that impacts all sectors of the economy. And in the housing sector, that impacts renters' ability to pay rent, and that impacts homeowners' ability to pay their mortgages. And as a response and recognition of the terrible crisis that we're facing, the federal government in the recent CARES Act has instituted protections for people who may face eviction and late fees during this crisis. And many state and local governments have instituted moratoria on evictions and foreclosures. I'm going to talk in general terms about those matters, in part because both eviction law and foreclosure law varies somewhat from state to state. And so there may be nuances to a particular state that may not apply in another context. So please take this with a grain of salt with that in mind. Additionally, the scope of protections that are available to folks under these moratoria also varies. I've just pasted 2 links into the comment chat section. One is from an organization called the National Low Income Housing Coalition, which is leading up efforts to address this broad housing crisis and provide resources to folks on the ground, as well as to advocate with federal legislators on long-term solutions. The first link for the National Low Income Housing Coalition is a link to eviction and foreclosure moratoriums. And so if you scroll down in the page, you'll be able to see sort of state-by-state lists of where there are protections. And then the second link is to an organization referred to as Eviction Lab. And that second link will provide you with the ability to identify those different moratoriums. And what it does is it actually scores them on the kinds of rights that they afford to tenants. I think the Eviction Lab is focused specifically on moratoria on eviction. And so those are 2 resources to know whether evictions have been and foreclosures have been suspended at the local or state level where you're located. That's important to know. If you are in a jurisdiction where an eviction or a foreclosure has been suspended, you still legally owe your rent and your mortgage payments for this period of time under the suspension. In some instances, those suspensions are in place through the end of April. In some instances, they're in place for longer, and these dates may be extended. But for the duration of the moratoria, in most instances, you can be evicted for non-payment under this period when those moratoria end. And so even though evictions are banned, your landlord still has the ability to secure rent. And so if under the moratoria you are able to pay rent, you should. If you are not able to pay rent, then you should take steps to work out with your landlord a plan to how to handle that. Or if you're unable to pay your mortgage, you should take steps to work out with your servicer how to enter into a forbearance or a delay on payment of your mortgage. Again, that doesn't forego the need to ultimately pay that mortgage note. It just changes the terms of the timing of those payments. We can talk more about what might be involved in communicating with your landlord or mortgage servicer about those plans. But in short, that's a little bit of an overview of who is protected from evictions and late fees during the COVID crisis. The one thing that I would add is that some tenants have additional protections to those that are outlined in those links in regards to the local and state moratoria that have been put into place. And specifically, under the federal stimulus law that was signed on March 27th, there is a 120-day ban until July 25th on evictions for non-payment and the charging of late fees for certain subsidized properties, that is, certain affordable housing. And that includes Section 8 vouchers, other vouchers like U.S. Department of Agriculture Rural Development vouchers, all HUD subsidized projects like project-based Section 8, project-based voucher properties, home properties, HUD subsidized senior housing and public housing, properties that receive low-income housing tax credits, and tenants whose landlords have a mortgage that is backed by the federal government, like FHA or other HUD mortgages, or a mortgage that is owned by Fannie or Freddie. And that includes over half of the mortgages that are out there. We talk more about how you can learn about what whether you may be covered by the CARE Act protections. But in broad terms, additionally to the local and state moratoria that put in place under the most recently passed stimulus measure, there are protections for those federally subsidized rental and rental housing options. So see that there may be some questions that have popped up here, and happy to address those or more that you might have about it, and happy to unpack how folks may engage in some of these negotiations with their landlords or their mortgage servicers.
Thank you. Yes, we're going to get to the questions. And for the audience members that are tuning into the webinar live, you could post the questions in the comment box or the question and answer box. I want to shift to this question about communicating with landlords. A question that's come to us in a situation we've been seeing is whether or not a landlord can actually force the tenant to turn over their stimulus check to pay rent, or whether or not the landlord can withhold your mail and withhold the stimulus check before we pay rent. This is a situation we've seen. So, I mean, the answer seems obvious, but if you could touch on, those two things, what should happen if that does occur, if the landlord does start pressing on certain issues, and, the proper way to negotiate, your rent and so forth.
Yeah. It's my understanding that a landlord cannot force a tenant to pay their rent with their stimulus check. There are certain measures that I understand very generally, and I'm not don't have the expertise to speak about in regards to outstanding credit issues that someone may have from a lender, and the ability for that lender to secure some portion of that stimulus check. But in terms of a landlord and tenant rental context, a landlord doesn't have the ability to require a tenant to produce their stimulus check payment for rent. Additionally, a landlord doesn't have the ability to withhold mail or change the locks or cut off utilities or physically remove possessions or threaten to call the police to make a tenant leave. If a landlord engages in any of those activities, it would be illegal. It's illegal for your landlord to take your mail or lock you out or throw out your belongings or cut off utilities without going through the eviction process. And of course, this applies really to jurisdictions that have these moratoria in place, which is many of them. But your landlord must get a court order to evict you. And if your landlord is trying to take your mail or physically remove you or your belongings from your home, you can call the police if you feel comfortable. The police should tell your landlord to stop. If your landlord tries to evict you without a court judgment or force you out by doing other things, you should seek advice from an attorney immediately.
Right. Thank you. One of the questions that came in, not sure if you could touch to this, has to do with college students that are being forced off their campuses. Whether or not they're responsible for the remainder of the rental agreements that they may have on their property, on their apartment or home that they're renting out there, and should they be entering into any new agreements for the fall while there's a lot of unpredictability on whether or not we're going to be even returning to our campuses?
So it's a great question. And the fact of the matter is, this is a novel situation. And some of the frameworks that we have, the legal frameworks that we have to address the rights and responsibilities that housing providers and consumers may have are not fully clear. And in any instance where you're contemplating what rights you may have in ceasing payment or terminating a lease, that will require, reviewing the contents of the lease. And in particular, if you move out before the end of your lease, most leases say that your landlord can, one, keep your security deposit. If you move out before the end of your lease, your landlord in some states can also try to charge you the rent that is due for the remainder of your lease. For example, if you move out 3 months into a year lease, the landlord could try to charge you the remaining 7 months of rent, even though you would not be living there anymore. Your landlord in many states does have a duty to mitigate damages under law, meaning that they have to try to re-rent the apartment. And in a litigation context, you may be able to reduce the damages that you owe under a broken lease for that non-payment. However, you should certainly review your lease to assess whether there are any terms in it that may supersede the responsibilities that you may bear under the lease. If there are any force majeure or act of God provisions, which may substantiate termination of the lease, then you could assert that the context of the crisis creates a situation in which you have the right to terminate your lease. I'm speaking in general terms here about landlord-tenant responsibilities, but those same contractual landlord-tenant responsibilities generally would apply to someone who's renting in a college or university context. Obviously, the situation of the crisis presents unusual circumstances. And one of the things that landlords, and I think this would be also true for universities broadly, may negotiate is forbearance on their mortgage payments. And if your landlord or university is receiving some sort of stimulus funding or able to negotiate a forbearance on the requirements that they have to pay their mortgage servicer for whatever university housing is in question or whatever housing in general is in question, you can approach the university to inquire about whether they're receiving a forbearance on their payment and suggest that they waive the rent that you have agreed to pay as a function of the waiver of the mortgage payment that they may be receiving from their lender. It's not a complete answer to the question, but it's some information that comes to bear on the answer.
Thank you, and it's appreciated. Again, we do have a couple questions that came in the question and answer box. I'll read one of them. What if your landlord uses your social security number to look up the status of your check and see it's been delivered and proceeds to ask for late rent? Would that be, is that permitted?
So, in terms of the use of your social security number to track your financial information, it raises privacy issues that I think are suspect. I am, a housing lawyer with expertise specifically in housing discrimination law, and, would defer to folks who are more suited to privacy rights and responsibilities to be able to speak to that component of the question. But I would question whether a landlord using your social security number to track information about you is appropriate and may raise some significant privacy concerns and legal violations. In regards to what information a landlord or anyone may use in negotiating over the payment of rent, regardless of whether they've used your social security number to assess whether you've received a stimulus payment or whether they just understand that broadly folks with a certain income would be receiving a stimulus payment, they may assert that you should use that stimulus payment to pay your rent. But that's not a right that they have to demand. Again, they are still entitled to the rent under the lease. But if you can't pay that rent and you need to use that stimulus payment for other essential items, then it's your prerogative, regardless of any assertions that the landlord may make about payment. And underlying any assertions that they may make about payment, the fact of the matter is, in many jurisdictions across the country, there are moratoria on evictions. And so what you should do in that situation is negotiate with your landlord to suggest that you're not in a position to make the payments that are being demanded, and negotiate an alternative. You may want to say something along the lines of, I want to keep you updated about my situation. I've lost my income or work or my job because of the COVID-19 crisis and cannot afford to pay my rent at this time. Would you be willing to waive the fees this next month, or agree to not evict me for not being able to pay my rent this month on time, and instead agree that after the state or other parties that may have these moratoria in place lifts the stay-at-home order, we'll work out a payment agreement that works for both of us. The way that forbearance programs work in general is you engage with your servicer to arrange for a payment, whereas those payments happen after a set date of non-payment. And those can happen over a period of time or on a set date or simply at the end of the term of the current mortgage. And, if a landlord is facing mortgage payments, you may suggest that or ask whether they're receiving a forbearance from their lender and whether they'd be willing to not charge rent for those months in which they're receiving a forbearance.
Thank you. I know we had a question that came in about whether or not a landlord can hold the security deposit to cover the rent. I'm not sure, that doesn't fall within the discrimination. It just appears that may be something about, within the contractual agreement.
Yeah. So that is that may be subject to many leases. And at the end of a moratorium, in addition to a moratorium on eviction, in addition to facing possible eviction for non-payment of rent, it's also the case that a landlord may retain a security deposit for that non-payment of rent. In negotiating with your landlord, the fact that they have a security deposit is an item that you may use to your benefit in the negotiations. And you may say, you know, would you be willing to waive my rent this month? Or in the alternative, apply my security deposit to the rent. And if you apply my security deposit to the rent, I'll agree to waive my right to claim my deposit at the end of the lease, and also agree to pay reasonable charges for damage above normal wear and tear after I move out, which is generally what the purpose of a security deposit is contemplated to do. And so your security deposit is subject under many lease agreements to recapture in an instance of non-payment. And so that may be a practical outcome, but it's also something that in an instance in which you are facing the inability to pay is something that you could negotiate with your landlord about serving as a placeholder in the context of your inability to pay.
Thank you. Then I also have a question. While you answer this, I'm going to pull up your website. There was a memo you guys put out about disability in COVID, and whether or not somebody that suffers from COVID is deemed, disabled or short-term disability. And is that something you can touch on? And I think, disability rights is important as well in this conversation. If you could touch on that as well.
Absolutely. Well, in regards to the work that we do at the National Fair Housing Alliance, which is specific to ensuring that people are free of discrimination in the housing market, protections for people with disabilities and civil rights in the housing market for people with disabilities is central to the work that we do. And so we issued a memo a couple of weeks ago that outlined the rights that people who have COVID-19 or those who have a history of having the virus and those who are perceived as having the virus, including those who may be servicing people with the virus in the healthcare profession, may be protected against housing discrimination under longstanding interpretations of the Fair Housing Act. People with disabilities under the Fair Housing Act is defined as an individual with a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits a major life activity, a record of having such an impairment, or being regarded as having such an impairment. And the law is not yet settled on the question of whether someone with COVID-19 would qualify as a person with a disability. But from what we understand of the disease and its impacts, there's broad consensus among the folks that we've engaged with in the civil rights community that it would be regarded as a disability. And with that comes certain protections. Number one, you can't be evicted just because of the fact that you have a disability. And if that's COVID-19, then that is a basis for preventing someone from evicting you on that basis. Or if you're a medical provider and someone evicts you because of your mere association with victims of COVID-19, that also would be a basis to assert a potential Fair Housing Act violation. Additionally, the Fair Housing Act prohibits landlords and others from asking whether an individual has a disability. And so if a housing provider is renting a unit and only will rent if you test negative for COVID-19, on the one hand, practically speaking, with the availability of testing at the current time, that really would preclude many people from being able to rent the unit. But in regards to fair housing disability protections as a matter of policy, that would likely be illegal. Additionally, if you are someone with the disease, COVID-19, and there's changes in housing policies that you need to accommodate your disability, you may have a basis to request an accommodation, and the housing provider may have an affirmative duty to provide that accommodation. That may be, dealing with issues regarding delay in a rental payment over a period of time, or a termination of a lease. We'll be happy to confer with folks otherwise about any specifics in regards to discrimination that people with COVID might experience in the housing market. In addition to speaking about these landlord-tenant and foreclosure or mortgage servicing issues that are really the featured part of this webinar, those discrimination issues are really central to the work that we do at the National Fair Housing National Fair Housing Alliance day-to-day, and I'd be happy to talk with folks otherwise directly about some of those issues.
Thank you. We had one more question, or actually it's a comment that came in, and it's about concern for immigrants and refugees that are coming from Syria, Yemen, Libya, and across from across the world. And I think, of course, these protections do extend to them, right, regardless of immigration status here in the U.S.
Absolutely. Another protection under the Fair Housing Act is you can't discriminate against someone on the basis of their national origin. And that's the country where they come from, or where they're perceived to come from, or their ancestors came from. And that applies to folks coming from Iraq or Syria or Yemen and Libya. It applies to folks who may be coming from China or Italy or other countries which have been perceived as having a high infection rate. And to the extent that anyone is discriminated against on the basis of their national origin in trying to rent a house, in regards to harassment that they may experience in their housing, that'd be an illegal violation of the Fair Housing Act and subject to enforcement. That's been the basis of our coordination with ADC in recent years, and we welcome continuing that partnership. If there are instances of those kinds of discrimination, we are ready to work with you to forward enforcement on those issues.
Thank you. Thank you. And I think we're about to wrap up unless there's any other questions coming in. But I do want to thank you, Morgan, for the work that you do, the partnership that we have with your organization. We value it very much. And as I said to our community members initially, the housing discrimination is not always on top of the list. But as you alluded to in the beginning, sometimes it's happening and you don't know what's happening. So we do have to take this seriously. And the information you offered is very valuable. So thank you for agreeing to be with us today. I will email out the links, and we'll put them in the description on the YouTube stream. And keep contact with ADC. We're going to offer more of these webinars as we move forward and get past this crisis. You could visit us at adc.org. Encourage you to make a donation so we can keep these moving along and keep our work going. So with that, Morgan, I want to thank you again for everything, and definitely we're going to be reaching out, and hopefully we don't have any issues, but if they do come about, we're going to do our best to address them.
Absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity to connect with you all today, and thank you for your ongoing partnership in this important work.
Appreciate it. Thank you, everybody. Take care. Thanks.